So today I think is when Andrew asked me to chair this. You know, this is a really important subject, and it's a topic close to my heart, and particularly for anyone in arboriculture, in the landscape industry, who are planting trees. And the definition of arboriculture in the Oxford English Dictionary is the management of trees for amenity purposes. That's it. Actually, we should drill down more, and a more detailed description would be the production, selection, planting, maintenance, management, and removal of all woody plants for amenity purposes. It's a really important definition. And in my mind, you know, we can all argue which is the most critical and the most important part of that definition, but in my mind, tree selection is one of the most important. If we get things wrong and we plant the wrong tree in the wrong place, then everything's going to go wrong. If we plant the right tree in the right place, and we might not need arborists, sorry, Arbor Association, we might not need to do pruning work to restrict its growth, etc. And today there is no excuse for planting the wrong tree in the wrong place. We have a legacy left today by our predecessors, by the Edwardians and the Victorians. At Kew, you know, I maintain and manage the legacy left by my predecessors. Many of them planted trees unaware of what they were going to do. They were new species being introduced from the old world, from the new world, with, you know, the only information available to them was from the plant collectors that introduced them, giving details of the size of the tree that seed, etc., was collected from. They didn't have bean, trees and shrubs hardy in the British Isles. They didn't have Andy Hirons' applied tree biology. They didn't have Hillier's guide to trees, etc. They didn't have the Bartram's time for trees to give them that information as to, you know, where that tree needs to go and what it's going to do. But today we are inundated with information, and there is no excuse for planting trees in the wrong place. So I hope that today, introducing this specification, a guide for specifiers, is a real leap forward for what we need to do. We have 2 speakers this morning, and then 4 speakers this afternoon after lunch, and then at the end we'll have a question and answer session, which I will chair as well. I'm going to keep the speakers to time, so we have plenty of information to do that. You know, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speakers, and I'm told they're going to, it's not a double act, but I think Andy Hirons, who we all know, is a senior lecturer at Myerscough College in arboriculture, will give the first part of the talk, and then Henrik Sjöman, I get it wrong every time, will give the second part of the presentations. Come all the way from Gothenburg in Sweden, where he's the curator of the Arboretum and the tree collections at Gothenburg University Botanic Garden. So, Andrew, if you'd like to give us your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that generous introduction, Tony, and we'll get straight into the presentation. This really is the outcome, if you like, of a project I've been working on for a couple of years now that was funded by NERC as a Green Infrastructure Innovation Project. And we felt at the time that there was a real deficit in good quality species selection information, and there was a need amongst the kind of green infrastructure community at large to access the information that is out there and perhaps some new information we can provide along the way. So it's really a NERC project, and that was a collaboration between us at University Centre Myerscough, Lancaster University and TDAG as our industry partner. So that's a sort of a little bit about the origins of the project. I don't want to spend a lot of time expanding the information of the benefits of trees. I think we can all agree that trees enrich our lives. They offer us innumerable benefits. Of course, not everything about trees is beneficial. We should acknowledge that, and getting the balance right and maximising the benefits is largely to do with selection. We have, of course, a conceptual urban forest, if you like, a proportion of that will be performing quite well. Some of that will be underperforming, and that may well be to poor site or possibly poor selection. But we have some strategic challenges. Of course, there's climate change. And along with climate change, we have the acceleration of, the accelerated migration of pests and pathogens. And that ultimately helps drive at least some of the urban forests into the realm of poor performance, and some indeed over the sort of mortality threshold. And so we have some really strategic challenges to try and meet over the coming decades. One of the things I did first with the project was to try and harness information from the community about how we currently select trees. And thanks to those of you that filled in the survey, we had about 300 responses, and we had a good cross-section of responses from across the UK and indeed from different groups as well. So that was a year or so ago now, and I just wanted to pick out some of the key information. We have, really, there's sort of 3 or 4 major sort of sources of guidance: the dendrological literature, online selection tools, tree nursery catalogues, and then obviously recommendations from tree nursery. And overwhelmingly across the major groups, actually the nursery catalogues dominated tree species selection. And I think we can understand why. There's actually some really good publications that are, visually impactful and are really quite useful. But there is perhaps a strategic problem with relying on the nursery catalogues to make selection decisions. So that was quite an interesting finding. In fact, some of the other sort of things I'll just point out is that online selection tools don't tend to be used a great deal, and the landscape architects understandably didn't engage that much with dendrological literature, and as I say, there's a whole sort of range of responses there, but the kind of take-home message is the dominance of those nursery catalogues. The other sources of information that were important to people, 37% said they experience was really useful, and of course experience is brilliantly useful, but it's necessarily backward looking. It's kind of what's worked in the past, and actually we need to be much better at having a vision of what we want to work in the future. So that's going to remain to be an important aspect of selection, but we also need to not rely on experience, because we're never going to develop our palette of species if that's the case. Only 4% actually engage with botanical collections and nurseries. Actually, that's a really sad in a way, isn't it? Because you can gain so much from talking to the professional growers, going and looking at your local botanical collections, and just seeing what works well. Not everything may be available, particularly if you go to Kew Gardens. Of course, a lot of their stock won't be available, but you'll get a really good flavour of what's going to work in that particular environment. Some of the other comments I just want to flag up from that survey: many of the nursery catalogues offer conflicting advice. Well, that's certainly true. If you've got a range of nursery catalogues and you look at the same species, it doesn't always marry up. Never depend on nursery catalogues alone. Well, good advice, but that's what we are depending on. And the hard technical information is difficult to come by, with nursery information often being superficial and based on aesthetic features. I don't think any of us can really say that those don't resonate to some extent. So it seemed then that it was appropriate to try and develop some new guidance. And this is what people really wanted out of their guidance. They wanted to know the mature tree size and form, have some idea of environmental tolerance, and drought tolerance was really key to that as well. And I want to just expand on the drought tolerance aspect of selection a little bit later in the presentation. But of course, suitability for the soil, actually aesthetic qualities, comes rather low down the list. That's often what people use as the most important decision. And then notable mentions, things like salt and pollution, conflict potential, wildlife and ecological value. So there's a whole range of information that is relevant. And actually one of the problems with tree selection is it can be so dizzyingly complicated with all these different nuances and soil and aspect and exposure and so on, that you know, it drives you down and think, well, that worked previously, I'll just use that again. It's a bit like being presented with 100 different meal options at a restaurant. You can't make a decision. But if you've got chicken or beef on a, you know, you can make that decision. I'm not saying that we need to go to those extremes, but selection can be over-complex, and it is a complex thing, but we need to sort of boil it down to the fundamentals. So that then led us to develop this new guidance, which this seminar is previewing this morning. One of the things that we emphasize is that actually tree selection, for me at least, has got sort of primary criteria that you really need to engage with and get right. And I've divided those into constraints and tree ecophysiology. The constraints are things related to the site, the rooting environment, the built structures, utilities underground, and so on. The biological constraints might be the diversity of species, invasive characteristics, practical constraints, budget. You know, we can't all afford to be spending £500 on a really weird and wonderful tree if you've got, you know, 20 or 30 of them going onto a site. So, but, you know, they're the kind of real world things, the design brief. You know, you need to understand those as a primary factor. And then the ecophysiology, that's a whole range of things. I've divided that into site and succession and tolerance. I'm going to explore that a bit more in a minute. But that's really the kind of the suite of information that means that the tree will survive fundamentally on the site. Because actually, none of the below criteria matter. You know, the ecosystem services or the aesthetics, none of that matters if the tree's dead. You know, a dead tree doesn't shade, it doesn't provide cooling. Actually, we want trees to perform well in the landscapes. So that's why we need to understand those primary criteria first before we then start thinking about functional uses. And so now I just want to explore a little bit more about the tree ecophysiology, partly because that's one of the subjects I'm interested in, partly because actually, particularly the drought element and the environmental tolerance is really fundamental to actually selecting the right species for your site. So in the UK then, we have a temperate oceanic climate. According to the Koppen-Geiger classification, there's a kind of range of different ways to classify climate. This is one I quite like, and that means that we have a mean temperature of the coldest month that is greater than 0 degrees, 4 months with a mean temperature of greater than 10 degrees, and a warm summer, which is the warmest month is less than 22 degrees, and no pronounced dry season. That's the way our climate is classified. If you go to Lancashire, you know, that's definitely true. There's definitely no pronounced dry season in Lancashire. Maybe down here, you get a little window of opportunity to top up your tan at some point during the summer, not so much in the northwest. But anyway, that's our climate. Of course, the habitat is really important as well, and indeed, even the provenance of species can play a really important role in how the tree will perform on the particular site. Something I just want to flag up here is the role of tree succession, and Henrik's going to be exploring this in much more detail in his part of the presentation. And things like weed competition are much higher in earlier successional environments. That's the sort of the pioneer environments, the open ground. Light is very high. Exposure tends to be higher. The growth rate of the tree species that perform well in those environments tends to be higher. And you oppose that to late successional conditions where you have, you know, generally much higher soil quality. The trees have to contend with shade to a much greater extent. They are used and perform better at the higher humidity level, and they tend to have greater longevity. So, you know, there's some fundamental aspects of tree succession that are really important for our selection decisions. And then the environmental tolerance aspect. These are the icons that we use in the guide, and what we've done is develop a 4-point scale. So that there's a tolerant, a moderately sensitive, and a sensitive within each of those 3 fundamental environmental constraints. And just out of interest, I did a bit of analysis just looking at the spread of species within the guide. So we've got about 280 species that are represented in this guide. And so shade, there's a bit of a balance. You know, you'd expect more perhaps in the moderately sensitive, moderately tolerant range than either extremes. Drought, again, there's somewhat of a balance. We've got quite a few drought-tolerant species, quite a few sensitive species as well. But I really want to flag up the waterlogging tolerance, because waterlogging is not really about the amount of water. It's about the lack of oxygen within the rooting environment. And look at that. Well over 80% of the species that are available to us to plant are really either moderately sensitive or sensitive to waterlogging, in other words, lack of oxygen. And when you think about that, we just can't ignore the role of aeration in our rooting environments, because we really do fundamentally restrict the amount of, or the type of species that will perform well. Okay, I mentioned earlier that survey pointed out that the drought was a really important aspect to get right and to understand, and the tolerance to drought is really key. And I just want to spend the next little bit of the presentation exploring how we try to develop our understanding of drought tolerance a little bit. I think perhaps one of the first things to do when you're talking about drought and water is to try and understand how much water landscape trees might actually use. And there's a really nice experiment that was done in Florida a few years ago by Richard Beeson. And he developed these really large-scale lysimeters. And they're effectively like load cells, if you like, that host these containers. And then if you understand and you restrict evaporation from those containers, you can really accurately measure the amount of water that's being moved through the system, because the whole container gets lighter as water moves up from the soil through the tree and evaporates away. And one of these, there's 4 species that are represented there, Acer rubrum being one. I'll just sort of talk through one in a little bit of detail. But you can see here, apologies, I can't do a laser on all 3 screens at a time. So I'm going to laser onto the middle screen. You can see here that before leaves are out, it's using around 10 litres a day, fluctuates around that. Look what happens when the leaves come out. Within the space of a few weeks, it's actually using over 100 litres a day. And that's, a really significant volume of water. And then as it goes through summer, eventually it begins to decline as the leaves senesce. Physiologically, older leaves tend to lose less water. They become less active and so on, as well as the temperature obviously declining from a seasonal point of view. So that's, really interesting. These, you can see the size of the trees here. They're not monstrous Great Plain trees like you see wandering around the streets here. That's a relatively modest-sized tree. Actually, you could plant a tree that size in an environment. And it's using 100 litres a day. Now, we've got to be a bit cautious. This is in Florida. They have a lot more warmth than us. But actually, what that illustrates really effectively is that trees require a really large amount of water. And the other thing that I just want to point out briefly is that there is variation across species. So this Magnolia grandiflora and a pine, they're using around 50 litres of water a day. So this is on the same site. So we've got quite significantly different species characteristics. The main thing that's going to be driving that is, of course, the atmospheric demand and the size of the crown, the leaf area that's acts as the evaporating surface. So that trees actually, they require a lot of water. So that's why it's really fundamentally important. But of course, when we look at our urban sites, actually climatic drought is only one. It's actually often a fairly minor component of the kind of drivers of water deficits. Compaction is really, really key, because highly compacted soils are pretty hostile to fine roots, and of course it's the fine roots that provide the main organs of uptake. We have issues with soil to root or root to soil coupling, and that's really key in the establishment phase. Getting those roots out of the original container into the host soil is really, really fundamental. And if you don't have a root system that enables that to happen, then obviously the soil volume that is available to take water from is much diminished. We have impermeable surfaces. These trees are about 40 years old. They're just sort of sat there. And when you look what they're planted into, actually it's little wonder. It's amazing they're surviving at all. But when you have that sort of those sorts of conditions, it doesn't really matter how much it rains because the rain doesn't get to the rooting environment. And so that's another factor that is important. Of course, at transplantation, we necessarily have to transplant only a portion of the root system, so we lose a great deal of those roots. And that plays a really profound effect during the early phase of establishment. And of course, restricted soil volume. This photograph from Johannesburg illustrates it beautifully. You know, those central trees in the car park there have got a much more constrained rooting volume, and they are woefully underperforming compared with those around the margins that have access just to that little bit more. Of course, not every tree requires much soil. These are rather the exceptions in Hong Kong. They add tremendously to the sense of place, and they can be somewhat problematic to manage. But just to say that in the tree world, there are always exceptions that prove the rule. And, you know, in general sense, actually, we plant trees in some pretty hostile environments. Some of the academic work also supports the role of drought tolerance. This was a really nice study done by Lara Roman and her colleagues in California. Now, California, you expect, has got a serious problem with drought to some extent anyway. But they did quite a large planting scheme, and they measured the performance of this cohort as it went through. And this, I just picked out a few quotes from the discussion, and I didn't really have to look very hard, and there's a clear theme. Actually, what happened was over the 5 years, there was about a 30% loss of trees. And they said the foundation may implement further changes, including planting a higher proportion of drought-tolerant trees. They were the ones that were surviving. We observed high survival species with low water use demand. Well, that's pretty much the same thing expressed in a different way. Drought-tolerant trees may be more able to withstand irrigation neglect. It may be prudent for this program to plant more drought-tolerant trees. Climate-appropriate species selection influenced tree survival during the establishment phase. There is a clear theme there, isn't there, that the drought tolerance is fundamentally important to the way trees will perform in our landscapes and will indeed establish. And if we look in nature, actually, there is plenty of really tough trees. This is Pinus nigra, growing in Corsica. And there's an olive, Mediterranean eucalyptus. I can't, always try and get a baobab into my talks. I like them. Unfortunately, we can't grow them here, really. But anyway, if only we could. There are plenty of trees in nature that perform well in drought-prone environments. So it's really about understanding what are the strategies, the mechanisms that allow those plants to achieve such success in those environments. So how do trees cope with limited water availability? Notice I'm not using the term drought. Drought really is a meteorological thing. It's to do with lack of precipitation. As I've tried to explain, water deficits can occur through a whole range of different mechanisms. So in broad terms, we have the avoidance of the water deficit and the tolerance of water deficit. And it's a bit like any sort of stress. At certain times of year, get stressed, believe it or not. And particularly around marking time, when I've got, dozens and dozens of scripts to mark or assignments to mark, and I'm a bit of an avoider. I try and stick my head in the sand, and then I panic at the last minute, and I have to spend weeks on end trying to meet my deadlines. Other people are much more kind of able to tolerate that stress. They don't avoid it. They just kind of keep going. And stress is in some ways similar in trees. We have the avoiders and the tolerators. And to avoid a water deficit, you've either got to maximize water acquisition or you've got to reduce the water use. They're really the two options. And I've tried to sort of break it down into what we call physiological, structural, and life cycle approaches. We've got things like deep rooting and root proliferation. If you can tap down into a water source 20, 30 meters beneath the surface, it doesn't really matter how much it rains because you've decoupled the precipitation from your supply of water. That's an avoidance strategy. Root proliferation. If you can exploit a really large volume of soil, then you're accessing a much greater volume of soil in order to take water up. Or you can reduce water use, closing the stomata, reducing the leaf and stem growth, actually also avoiding the period of drought altogether. So we have in the Mediterranean region summer deciduous trees that just lose their leaves during the dry period because there's not enough to maintain a crown. And we have, of course, leaf abscission. A number of species will basically lose their leaves in response to water deficit. They're not really tolerating. I think they're just avoiding the deficit building up in the building up within the tree. We have other mechanisms, other trees that have this tolerance, and it's these osmotic adjustments, a low turgor loss point, and reduced sensitivity to drought-induced cavitation that are really important for trees tolerating that drought, that water deficit. I would say avoid the avoiders for challenging sites, because actually they typically lose their leaves. This is a pot-grown alder in my garden. I went away for a particularly warm week, and it was crispy by the time I got back. And actually, it recovered really well as soon as it rained and it was watered again. And you wouldn't tell now, but we don't really want that sort of thing going on in our landscape trees, do we? That's not the vision of a well-performing tree. Look at this Betula euthalis on the right. In a highly constrained rooting environment, actually that's the end of summer. If you look towards the right-hand image, there's a birch planted just there in a slightly large volume of soil with a really healthy crown. That tree, technically speaking, is surviving, but it's not what you would call performing. So that's why it's important to really separate and try and understand which trees have these avoidance characteristics and which trees are more tolerant. And so the drought-tolerant trees, they're just able to better extract water from the soil, they can maintain physiological activity, and they just perform much more effectively on those challenging sites. So how do we currently select for drought tolerance? That's a really key question, isn't it, for this morning's talk? Well, we can take advice from literature. There's a range of dendrological literature there. And if you take any one species, similar to the fact that you take any one species with a nursery catalogue, you can actually get rather different results depending on which text you look at. So, some would suggest that it grows along stream banks, floodplains and swamps. Others say very heat and drought tolerant. Drought tolerant, it's native along streams and ponds, useful for dry to sterile soil. So if you're a practitioner with perhaps not a great background in physiology, then that's pretty confusing. So we want to try and see what we can do to improve the quality of the information that you get. One of the things we can look at is looking at something like a drought tolerance index. There was a really good study published back in 2006 that ranked 806 species according to their drought, shade, and waterlogging tolerance. This is a really fantastic resource, but it looks fundamentally at survivorship. It doesn't look at whether things tolerate or avoid. And I won't sort of go through all the details, but effectively, 1 is a very sort of wet, consistently well-watered sort of environment, and 5 is the other end of the extreme, long periods of water deficits and lack of precipitation and so on. So that is something that we can look at. And so one of the things that we've done in our guide is to take this sort of information and translate it for you so that it's more accessible. So rather than 2.73 on the scale, we've made a decision as to whether it's sensitive, moderately tolerant, or tolerant. And in broad terms, 1 to 2 is sensitive, 2 to 3 is moderately sensitive, 3 to 4 moderately tolerant, 4 to 5 tolerant. So that's been a sort of starting point where that information has been available, but we wanted to do a little bit more and drive the quality of information further. And so we looked at this trait-based assessment, and Henrik and I have been working on this theme for a number of years now. And one of the characteristics we look at is this thing called leaf turgor loss point, the permanent wilting point. If you think about, a plant wilting in a pot, it's the point at which it won't recover from wilting even if you start watering it. We're looking to quantify that figure, if you like. And then the stem water potential at 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity as well. I'm going to look at both of those just briefly. And there's plenty of information in the academic literature to suggest that this leaf turgor loss point is a really important quantitative trait to evaluate. And I can talk to you about the method if you're interested, but effectively we use something called the osmotic potential at full turgor, and then there's a linear relationship between that and this turgor loss point, so we can predict one from the other. And we use that then to rank species. And the first study that Henrik and I did, we collaborated. Henrik was at a postdoc in Cornell University at the time, so we collaborated there with Nina Basic, and we looked at maples, the genus Acer, because we understood there to be a good range of drought tolerance within those species. And actually, this is a sort of one of the major figures from the paper that we put together. The less negative, so -1, -2, that's less negative. They're the more sensitive species, and the more negative are the more tolerant species. So we're able to rank, according to their summer turgor loss point, the species drought tolerance. And actually what we found was that if we looked at something like Acer spicatum here, growing in the understory of the forest around the New York state, that actually it had a turgor loss point of about -1.6 megapascals. So really quite sensitive. But in that environment, really there's not a great atmospheric driver. There's plenty of soil moisture. They're permanently shaded. There's no need for that particular species to really drive its drought tolerance from an evolutionary point of view. Acer truncatum in the Qingling Mountains, again, similar understory species, quite a humid environment, often rains, or when it's not raining, it's, quite humid, cloudy conditions and shaded. So again, that was -2.4, relatively sensitive to drought. Whereas we oppose that to Acer tataricum, growing in the steppe forest of Romania, -3.6, and Acer grandidatatum here in the Rockies, -3.8 megapascals. So we're able to sort of segregate out the species according to their summer leaf turgor loss point. And we found also differences in cultivars. So, that might be to do with the particular ecotype or provenance that the cultivar first originated from. But there is some differences in cultivars. So it might be that if you wanted a more drought-tolerant Acer rubrum, Northwood would be a better bet than October Glory or Red Sunset. So really, how do we practically use this information? Well, we take a scheme like that, and if we have the sensitive species and we try and put them into these sort of really highly constrained rooting environments, that's never going to work. They can't cope with such a small rooting environment and little capacity for access to water. So you're much better off taking these fundamentally more tolerant species and putting them into those sorts of conditions. Not that they will do a lot better, certainly, than the more sensitive species. The other thing I should note is that some species which you think, according to an ecological survivorship scale, like the Ninimets and Valladera scale, perform quite well on their scale, actually avoid drought by deep rooting. Well, clearly, if you've got a deep rooting strategy, that's pretty redundant in those sorts of soil environments or podium plantings and so on. So we did assess this wide variation and suggest it's a really useful trait, and we provide evidence for nurseries taking on new species potentially, that this new plant material might be better because we can screen, we can quantify this and take some of the experience out. And so really now we've got well over, I think, 200 species around.
No,
more.
300, 350 probably.
Really, yeah. So we've got hundreds of species that we've evaluated. And it's been a collaborative effort between, people like Cornell, SLU, University Centre Myerscough, funded by Tree Fund for Trees. The NERC project I've just been involved with looked at this. And we had access to material at Nest Botanical Gardens, Kew, and Hillier Nurseries. So we've really tried to do what we can to improve the quality of information there. And so what we've done, we're not giving you the megapascal figure in our guide. We're saying, okay, well, those that are less than 2.5 are sensitive. Those that are between 2.5 and 3 are moderately sensitive, 3 and 3.5 moderately tolerant, and over 3.5 tolerant. So we can, our recommendations in terms of the environmental tolerance are sort of underpinned by this trait data. But we've interpreted that for you, so it doesn't really matter if you don't understand the science behind it. You can come and ask me about it or read our papers, that's fine. But we've tried to translate the literature somewhat and our own research so that it's accessible for you as decision makers. And one of the things that we were also keen to do is say, well, okay, well, does this really translate into practice? And so part of that survey that I did a year or so ago was to say, okay, well, here's about 20 species. I'm going to give you a qualitative scale, 6-point qualitative scale. You just put that tree, if you've got experience of it, put that and allocate that tree to what you think it should be. And actually, we found that there was a significant relationship between our quantitative trait and the qualitative kind of suggestion that the professionals that engaged with the survey suggested. So that, for us, was really reassuring. It means that actually we can anticipate the performance of urban trees in this way. I want briefly to talk about another trait which we've been evaluating, and this is the percentage loss of hydraulic conductivity. Under ideal situations, we have a 0% loss of hydraulic conductivity. The xylem, the plumbing, if you like, is working really effectively. It's conducting water between the roots and the crown. But actually, as the tree gets more stressed, what happens is air gets pulled into the xylem, and that creates embolism. And that effectively reduces the conductivity of the stem. And so what happens is, as we develop this water stress, if you like, measured as a water potential, we get a progressive loss of conductivity. And so this is Pseudophyllum japonicum. This is actually a rather sensitive species. 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity is a sort of standard measure of drought tolerance. And so that's just beneath -2 megapascals. And at P88 here, this is when it's curtains. This is when it's really, the tree's dead at that point. Okay, that's around -2.5 megapascals. So that's a sensitive species. You oppose that to something like Eucommia, and you'll see that the scale's quite different. Here, Eucommia has a water potential of around -3.5 to 4, where it's got a 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity. And it doesn't really, we're talking mortality at around -6 megapascals. So again, that's quantitative data that we can interpret and feed into guidance for you. And the consequences, of course, are clear. If you have a disconnect between the roots being able to supply water to the crown, then you get marginal dieback and, obviously trees that are performing poorly and ultimately are much harder to maintain and probably many times need removal as well. So how am I doing for time, Tony?
Yeah, you have plenty of time.
Plenty of time?
Yeah.
Excellent. Is the right answer. Okay, so I hope that's given you a little bit of a background as to the science that's underpinned the guidance. I just want now to link to the guide itself. Ooh, cannot open the specified file. Okay, fear not. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so this is your guide, soon-to-be guide. So I should... thank you. Perfect. Okay, this is actually your guide. So I should acknowledge that, again, that NERC are the primary funders. We've got some academic partners, largely Henrik and myself in our respective institutions, some sponsors for the guidance, the Arboriculture Association, the Horticulture Trade Association, and the Royal Horticulture Society as well. And there's going to be some front matter, so an introduction to how to use this guide. We then got a chapter on the principles of tree selection. So it will be sort of, look like the family of TDAG documents that I'm sure you're all familiar with. I talk a little bit about the figure that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the constraints, ecophysiology, and these primary and secondary criteria, succession, and some other fundamentals which I'm going to revisit in a minute. And then we have the profiles key. So there's a sort of front matter explanatory chapters, if you like. And then we've got a profiles sort of section, and about 280 profiles to look at. And one of the nice things about having a digital-only guide is that we can use hyperlinks to navigate the document. So you can click on the profiles key, and this gives you an idea of the sort of information that will be on there. We've got 6 use potentials. Park, which is really, any tree can be used in a park, providing the soil and various other aspects of the environment are okay. Street, where we impose, it's got to be at least moderately tolerant to drought. Okay, so we sort of imposed various criteria on these different use potentials. It's impossible, by the way, to sort of say, well, what's going to be best on a spring, June day on a north-facing courtyard, in southwest London, or whatever. You can't get that sort of level of detail. That's kind of for you to do. What we've done is taken 6 sort of surrogate sites, if you like, and say, well, these are what we feel work within those sites that we do define. So street, for example, has got a moderate tolerance to drought imposed upon it, because we know they're pretty challenging environments. Suds actually has got moderate tolerance to drought and moderately tolerant to waterlogging, because actually, although it's to do with water and storm management, the rooting environments are so highly designed, they're so free draining that when it's not wet, they're really, really dry. So, actually, if you put something that's just flood tolerant into that substrate, then it just doesn't cope with the dry periods when it's not raining. So it's quite a precise and specific set of conditions. So those species got to be moderately tolerant to drought and moderately tolerant to waterlogging. Small gardens, well, similar to park in a way, but kind of constrained in terms of site. Coastal trees are more capable of coping with saline aerosols or salty winds and so on. And transport corridor, they're better at coping with salty rooting environments as well as a bit of air pollution. So we've kind of put these constraints and identified the use potential of trees. Obviously, there's the mature size, crown form, crown density information in there. There's some information on the natural habitat. One of the things that we really strongly feel is that linking the habitat of a species to its use is really fundamentally important, and Henrik's going to expand upon that in his section. Then we have these environmental tolerances and the ornamental qualities, peak flowering times, peak fruiting times, divided up into late summer, early spring, at the sort of seasonal level, and then a few other characteristics about leaves and the stems. So you'll have an alphabetical listing of all the species, and these have been sort of really what's available within the UK market. We didn't want, and in the focus group for the project, really found it important not to incentivise importing really weird and wonderful things. Actually, that's the last thing we want to be doing. We want to be supporting our UK nursery industry and making sure that things can be brought into the landscape in a biosecure and sustainable way. So we've done that sort of screening for you, but you can have a look. So you can then just click on the chosen species, and the information is quite clearly laid out there with the use potential, characteristics. You'll notice at the bottom there are things like issues to be aware of. So in the case of Acer rubrum, they can release a lot of pollen, so have high allergenicity potential throughout the flowering period. Where we have indications of high biological volatile organic compound emissions, we've also noted that in the issues, as well as things like, this is going to sucker like crazy if you stick it in. We don't phrase it quite like that, but you get the gist. And then we've got notable varieties. So whether it's a kind of species type habit, if you like, whether it's upright or columnar, good autumn colour, no seeds. That can be quite important for some selection decisions. So we've tried to make that information accessible to you. And then you can go straight back from that profile back to the species listing with the hyperlinks, and perhaps look at another species you might be interested in, and navigate around the document like that. So we think that should make it much nicer to work digitally off an iPad or your computer to sort of move around. We also have this at the end, selector guide. So we'll have the use potential. So you can kind of look at everything. Okay, I've got a SUD scheme. Let's have a look. Okay, I've looked at Acer rubrum. Oh, don't know what Acer zerschense looks like. So you can then go back to there and look at that species, and then you might go back and say, okay, well, I need something that is I don't know, different SUD species. Or perhaps you think, actually, I really need something that's tolerant to drought. What are my options? So you can click on the selector there, and then, okay, let's have a look at something like Circis. So you can see that it should be really quite nice to navigate around, and we're going to try and provide all that for you, as I say, for about 280 species. Okay, let's see whether I can get back to the presentation. Ooh. The last thing I really want to do as part of this talk is just to emphasise that tree selection is only one component of getting tree establishment right. If we fail to really engage with the nurseries and get high quality plants, then we're not going to establish those trees, even if they're the right species. If we fail to acknowledge the rooting environment or the arboricultural practice that installs the tree into that environment, then the likelihood of establishment is much diminished. So tree selection is fundamental, it is important, but it's not the only thing in securing establishment. So how do you get this guide? Well, at the moment it's available to pre-register. What we want to do is get people to register for it, because then as we update the guide, then we can send you the new guide, because it's all digital. And so we're asking you to register your interest, either using myerscough.ac.uk/tree selection, or, of course, via the TDAG website if you go to Guides and Resources, or in fact it's even on the homepage as well. And you can get through to this form. We just want to collect some really basic information about who you are and your occupation, so that we can understand the community that's using it more effectively, but also, as we have new iterations, new additions of this, add new species, update the photos and so on, we can share those new additions with you. And it's free. It's free, so it's pretty good value. I'm tempted to say you get what you pay for, but it's better than that. It's better than that. Okay, it's like all the TDAG documents, they're really, well, I hope it will be a really useful tool. So please do sign up, and then you won't miss out. We're anticipating it'll be ready in a month or something like that. So some point in April. We're just tracking down a few missing photos and things like that at this stage. And so where do I see the future of this guide? Well, I want it to be part of a discussion between us, people like Henrik and myself, who are academically interested in tree selection and trying to improve the quality of information for you, the community that are specifying trees, and you. So you can feed back, we'd really value this information, or we actually think you've really not got that species right, these are the reasons, can you revise that decision? So it's the opening gambit, if you like, in a conversation between us and you. We hope to regularly review it, we hope to be able to be responsive, so if we get a really serious pest or pathogen, Asian longhorn beetle, something like that, we can quite quickly go through and put an icon next to all the species that are vulnerable to that, or add an appendix and say, okay, these are the guys that are going to be vulnerable to this new pest, and then pump that new revision out to you. So that's why it's important to make sure you sign up. We want it to be a responsive document. We've done this foundational work now with the help of NERC funding and others, and we hope that in the future it won't take a huge amount of additional funding to get some reiterations and reviews out to you in response to what you really would like to see. So, am I roughly on time? Perfect. There we go. That's it. I hope you've enjoyed that sort of little insight into what I've been up to for the last year or so. And yeah, we'll have a chance to really explore some of your questions in the panel discussion later. But thanks for listening.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for having me here. My name is Henrik Sjöman, and it feels like I'm probably the only one that it's not native English speaking here. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. And if it's not true, there's someone. I'm Italian. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Oh, there you go. Then it's much more relaxed. So if I suddenly stop talking, I go through some kind of crisis in my head, trying to find the right words and so on. So be aware that it's not a stroke or something. It's just me go through it. All right. I work both at the university, agriculture science. I've been working there for 18 years with research and teaching about plants generally. The last 10 years, I've been mainly woody species, like tree selection, tree design, and so on. My background, I'm a landscape architect. And the last 2 years, I also work as a scientific curator at the Botanic Garden in Gothenburg. So I'm the black sheep there among all the botanists. I'm like the tree use guy, or the plant use guy there. So that's my background there. And I've been working with Andrew for many years now because we have this same. It was meeting in a bar in Birmingham actually on a tree conference. We talk about tree selection and so on. And actually Tony was the one that's supporting us with beer all the night. So thanks for that. So we've been working for a long time now with tree selection, and for me working for a long time with tree selection for an urban environment, it feels like it's starting to move in a positive way, especially from a Scandinavian perspective. Because before I started university, I worked with designing gardens, private gardens, but also public green areas and so on. And at that time, this is 25 years ago or something, you always get the leftover spaces when they have planned everything, then take in the green guy. And I come in there and I try to make something, but the best places in the area was always taken. For parking places, or the pipes underneath the infrastructure below ground was always taken. So I have this, I can have a tree there, I can have something there, and so on. So it was hard for me to communicate the importance of trees, because at that time trees was only an aesthetic. Please come and make it beautiful with your plants. That's it. And I would like to start with, to take some credit about the new attitude towards trees in a way. And that's because the last 15 years, the research shows that trees are more important than just an aesthetic way. And by then, it's this trees and the ecosystem services. Because before, it was difficult to argue why we should have trees. Why should we invest in trees? But the last, as I said, 15 years, the research shows that it's important because they can deliver this and this. We can actually earn money if we planted trees, because we have to plant them there. Then we can earn even more money and so on. Because before that, when it comes to buildings, we can actually argue, like, oh, if we change the window to this window, or we have to change the materials in the walls and the roof, then we can earn money. But it's going to be expensive to invest, but after 5, 10 years, that's the investment is home. We earn money after that. But that was difficult when it comes to plants there. But now I feel like the attitude changed. In the US, there's been more or less a revolution now when it comes to the attitude of tree planting with all this million tree project. And in UK, it's going in the right direction as well. And Scandinavia, we are in the very beginning now. The stakeholders, the policymakers, the politicians start to understand that, well, trees are important. We have to improve the budget for tree planting, and an attitude and seriosity have increased as well. But the problem, and Tony was that in the beginning when he was introducing this day, that trees, this is important to bear in mind, because the capacity among trees to deliver these ecosystem services are in many cases, almost most cases, connected to healthy and large trees. It's not rocket science, because if you look at trees, going to mitigate the microclimate by shading or reducing cold winds. The larger the tree is, the better effect it has. This means that taking care of existing trees, large trees, old trees, large, healthy old trees, is very, very important, because they have the capacity to make a big difference. But at the same time, the planning or the planting of the next generation of tree is extremely important, that we select the right plants for the right site and also the right plants for the right function. But we're not talking about the ecosystem service here. We might meet another time to talk about it, because when it comes to plant selection, it's also very important to choose the right plant for the right function, because when it comes to ecosystem services, there is difference between species and even cultivars. But that's another story. But that's what Tony said, that plant selection, all these fancy words about a green infrastructure, ecosystem service, tree canopy covers and so on, is nothing if we don't care about the tree selection. So that's the key thing with all this planning of the green infrastructure, the selection of the next generation of trees. So therefore, we need to be more careful, to learn more about the trees, as Andrew was talking about. We need to become small geeks or nerds, really go into the details to understand how vulnerable they are or how tolerant they are for different kind of urban environment. Because if we don't care, we continue to do like this, we're forcing trees into a situation where they have no idea how to handle. This is outside Malmö, southern Sweden. It could be here in the UK as well. And this is a planting site which actually is better than it looks, because half of this parking area is structured soil. So the rooting volume is pretty generous. So the growing condition is better than they look, but still they have chosen a sycamore maple. I don't know why they've chosen that one. Anyway, sycamore maple is one of the most moist demanding trees among the large growing maples. And still, even if they have structured soil here, it's too extreme for this species. So they just fail completely due to poor plant selection. And you can see that over and over again, that you force plants into a situation. And these trees will never ever be part of this, delivering all this ecosystem service, and be part of this sustainable urban environment where the green infrastructure is an important part. So the take-home message here is that we have to care about the selection process, actually go into detail to question ourselves for a planting or a design plan. What's the capacity of trees to grow here? What's the tools, the traits they have developed in order to be successful here? We have to care about stuff like that. The second challenge we are in front of is probably the most difficult one, and this is connected to diversity. Because this is the situation today. This is from a paper we did 2012. We do it again this year because we have new data, but it shows more or less the same thing, that we rely on a few species. We have this comfortable zone, like, oh, I know Tilia, let's go for Tilia and so on. Look at the situation in Helsinki. This is all trees in both street environments and park environment in Helsinki, Finland. And they have almost 45% of one species of lime. And in street environments in Oslo, Norway, they have TDAG. They don't know plants that much, Norwegian. We don't like Norway right now because it was a Winter Olympics pretty recently. So we have this problem now. But given a year or two, we're friends again. Anyway, there's probably Tilia europea here too. But you see that it's a very uneven diversity when it comes to public trees. And this is not a Scandinavian problem. This is a global problem. This is a paper we do when we're reviewing tree inventories around the world. You can see, are we in Camden now? We are. All right, here you go. This is Camden alone, Pittsburgh, Beijing, Barcelona. Same thing. 2 to 3 species of trees that stands for more than half of the tree population. And this is stupid. It's also very, very dangerous. I will come back to that very soon. But also, if you go through and start to analyze this diversity data and go through what's the diversity between street environments or paved environments compared to park environments. And this is not rocket science, pretty clear things. That, of course, it's harder to get a great diversity in street environment because street environment or paved environment represent a very tough, challenging growing condition. So it's hard to find a great catalog of species that can grow there and develop well and become these large, healthy trees. But in park environments, Henrik said, it's much easier to find a greater diversity, of course, because the growing condition is better. But the thing is, ask yourself, where do we need trees for delivering this diversity of ecosystem services? Sometimes it's in the paved environment. This is where we need trees even most when it comes to stormwater management, all these regulating ecosystem services, culture ecosystem services. They are almost most important in the paved environment. So this is the challenge. So this is the challenge me and Andrew work with for a long time, trying to broaden the catalog of promising species in this environment. So when it comes to this lack of diversity, there are several threats. And this is maybe it's a scary threat. We did a review in 2014 just to scare up the politician people in Sweden. Just, come on, diversify. And we just review literature to see how many species is documented get affected by the Asian longhorn beetle or the citrus longhorn beetles. Do you know the citrus longhorn beetle? It's naturalized in Italy already. That's a bad thing, because you can see Asian longhorn beetle have a host range of 137 species, while the citrus longhorn beetle have a host range of 188 species. That's scary stuff. And the question is, if we're going to get these beetles into London, the question is when? Because all this global trading, it increases the chances that we get this in. And it's not trading by plants, it's trading by other goods. We can't blame the nursery industry that get this stuff in. And if you read this and do this kind of tree loss scenario, which we played also with, this is the Nordic cities in Scandinavia, where we had different kind of scenarios. You can see here that, for example, Gothenburg, Stockholm have the potential to lose over 90% of the trees in public areas due to these two pests. And the reason to that is this lack of diversity. So what we stand in front of is two really big challenges. One, we have to increase our knowledge by choosing right tree for right site. We have to care about the detail, the ecological traits the trees have developed. We have to care about that, so we really design the right plants for the right site. And secondly, maybe the most difficult challenge is to get out our comfortable zone, to start to test untraditional species. Don't work with London plane anymore, or lime trees or maples, just who the other ones. Start to try, because they are not difficult to get hold of. Look at the tree nursery catalogue at Bartram. They have plenty of trees in the production. Hilliers, they have even more, or not even more, sorry about that. But they have, yeah, it's not going to be any free beers for Bartram today. I'm sorry about that. But they're good in both ways, you know. They also have, but together they have this enormous catalog of species they can use. But we don't use them. We are in this country. We have to go from that. Is that okay? Do you understand? Good. Is everything clear? My English is okay so far? All right. Moving on. All right. So this was more or less the theory behind that we need to increase the catalog species, the diversity, and so on. And the next part is this, that we go through the... Yeah, but the name. Yeah, the tool. What's the tool we have? Let's see. Selection program. Yeah, the stuff that Andrew talked about. Yeah. Anyway, so I thought we'd go through some of the site situation where we have recommended species for, and we start with park environments. And I also included the garden, because these two site situations is more or less the same when it comes to growing condition. Why we are dividing is that in garden habitat we have smaller trees that don't become too large. That's the only difference. So it's the difference between these two is just the scale. The smaller trees belongs to the garden, and the bigger trees is the park trees. So just the scale. But when it comes to site situations, it's more or less the same. But as Andrew said, the park environment represents a growing condition that is more or less heaven for most of the trees. I just have to show some pictures from the Botanic Garden in Gothenburg. This is the rhododendron valley of the Botanic Garden. And it's full of rhododendron. But park environments, as I said, this is Hyde Park, by the way, in London, so you feel comfortable. represent, of course, good growing condition. It's more or less unlimited rooting space, and also the soil quality many times really, really good. So most of the plants really can grow here and grows really well. But there is limitation or challenges even in park environment, especially when it comes to establishment of trees. Because there will always be trees that are difficult, hard to establish, even in park environment, while there also be trees that are really easy to establish in park environments. And by knowing which will be difficult and which will be easy to establish in park environment, by understanding the succession, the term succession, what it is, but also what's the different parts or the stages in the succession stands for, and also which stage in the successions the different species belong to. Suddenly you understand why some species are easy, but also you understand why some species are difficult, but also why it will be difficult to plant them or establish them even in park environment. So I thought we have a little bit crash course in succession. Is that okay? Everybody knows what succession is. Succession is the three-dimensional change of a place over time. That's it. That's simplified to what succession is. It's actually the change, the journey a vegetation takes from the forest fire, the day after the forest fire or the volcano, all the way to the mature forest. That's the journey we're going to talk about. And this journey have different kind of phases or stages, which is important to understand where, and also understand where does the trees belongs to in these stages there. But first of all, we go through the succession, because there are different types of succession. First of all, we have primary succession. This is when nature starts from the very, very beginning. This is the lava desert on Iceland. This is a 100-year-old lava desert, which starts to become a forest. This is the first day, moss and lava. It takes thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years before we actually have a forest here. You know the saying in Iceland? If you get lost in a forest in Iceland, do you know what to do? Stand up. That's the saying. Don't say it to them because they get like, oh, we have one for it. Anyway, but this is a primary succession there. But the secondary succession, this is what we more are used to. This is when you have something changed, some kind of disturbance in an already existing kind of vegetation system. You have what you don't have in the primary succession. You have this soil profile already existing, which takes tens of thousands of years to become. But also you have a gene pool of trees or other plants that will occupy these disturbed places there. This is an avalanche in the Appalachian Mountains, where we try to come back on and off just studying which trees comes in and which phases and how it develops over time. It's going to take some time, but it's really interesting to follow this. So what's happening in this stage, directly after this disturbance, is that you have the annual comes in, the 1-year-old plants, the herbaceous plants, which we call specialist, disturbance special, or ruderal plants. This is from Moldavia. This is a agriculture field that have been abandoned. So this is what's happening first year. This is 1 year or annual delphium, which is the weed that they have in Moldavia. This is, by the way, James Hitchmore for Sheffield University. He's responsible for the Olympic Parks here in London, by the way. He was with us and studying the meadows in Eastern Europe for a while there. But anyway, this is what's happening. And much of the seeds from this species are already in the ground. They came from maybe 10 years ago or 100 years ago. They're just waiting in the soil for this disturbance. And when this disturbance comes, it sees their opportunity, grows up really quick, flowering a lot quick, produce seed, drop the seed, die. That's the agenda. They're true rock and roll plants. Live fast, die young. They are the one, the really, really quick one. But that's the old agenda. But if not, the farmer comes here and do some kind of disturbance here, the next year or the year after that, these plants are gone. Because the next plant that comes in succession are the grasses, the perennial grass. Grass. Is that okay? Grass, sorry. Grasses. Grass, all right. There. Grass. You grass, all right. Moving on. They come in later on, the perennials, grass come in, and they are very competitive. They are strong. They compete very effectively both for space and for resources. They just take over. So if we come back here 2 years after this picture, it's just be a grass meadow, dominated by grass. But grass, if not the grass is grazed or mowed, it will decrease itself, because grass is producing a lot of biomass. And when the biomass wilts in the autumn, it will decrease itself. It just mulch itself. So what's happening then, it's in this grass meadow, it creates different kind of patches where other plants can establish themselves. And then the next phase in the succession comes in, but because the patches are taken by perennials, herbaceous perennials, that takes over. And that comes in this, the meadow phase, where you have grass together with perennials. This is from Transylvania in Romania, where you have this meadow. So I think it's 2 or 3 different species of salvia here. There's going to be a lot of pictures from Romania, I realized when I go through the pictures this morning. Romania is a really good place to studying the whole Europe in one country, because they have Western and Central European vegetation system and also the East European vegetation system in one country. And it's very easy to drive around and see all this. So that's why Romania is a really interesting place to do this kind of vegetation research. So that's why Romania is coming back over and over again. Good food, strange music, but otherwise Romania is a really cool place to go to. But what also happens when this grass makes these patches is also the pioneer species of woody species comes in, because they take these also patches to germinate and come in. Here it's important to understand the woody species, the trees and shrubs that establish in this phase, the pioneer species, are one of the toughest ones, because imagine to come in this phase with all these herbaceous plants and grass is already there, the competition you meet is pretty tough. So the trees and the shrubs in this section, or this phase of succession, are really successful for competing for resources in this stage. So they can really take weed competition really well. One of the main strategies that they do is to penetrate root system deep into the soil, because the first 20 centimeters is occupied by the grass and the perennials. There's nothing resources to get there. But if I can penetrate down below that, I have plenty of resources I can take. But also you have to understand the climate situation on this site, because it could be very, very extreme. The plants have to take this, especially when it comes to temperatures, early and late in the season. For example, in the spring, in Sweden, for example, we can have 2 or 3 minus degrees Celsius at night and 12 degrees plus in the day. So you have this enormous fluctuation for temperatures during the 24 hours. This could be very, very stressful for plants, but they can take it. But also the environment, a lot of wind, a lot of sunlight. You have this enormous evapotranspiration, so they can also take the stress that as well. But also, the pioneer species get unlimited with sunlight, so they have all the resources above ground, so they're very successful at that. And an advantage that trees and shrubs have, they can grow above the grass and the herbaceous plants in order to get resources away. So what's happening when these trees, the pioneer species, grows and be more successful because they come above, they don't have to compete for sunlight with the grass. They create this kind of forest, the pioneer forest types. This is how Sweden and Finland looks like, more or less. Not really, but yeah, some parts of Finland and Sweden looks like this. This is a pioneer forest of birch trees, Petula pendula, of course, which were the pioneer species in the meadows, but now they have grown up and creating this forest and more or less a dense canopy, which decrease the sunlight coming down, which also decrease the competition of weeds. But also, this canopy, this system of trees, creating a very unique microclimate in here, with high humidity, but also less evapotranspiration, less stressful, less with wind, no sun that comes in and drought. So in here is a very, very nice growing condition. And then you can see here some of the late succession species like, oh, thank you, they want this kind of environment. In this case, the Piscia arbius, the spruce, Norwich spruce, oh, I don't know. Swedish spruce, yeah, I know. Anyway, so they come in this space, and they really need this because a lot of these late successful species are very sensitive for weed competition and this extreme exposed condition. But these late successful species, they have high demands of the growing condition. But as a consequence to have this high demands is that they have to accept less light condition or less quality of light condition. So that's why we find most of the drought tolerant, the most shade tolerant plants we know are the late successful species because they start here underneath already existing tree canopy. Remember, this is extremely simplified story about the succession, but still it goes through the different stages, and it's good to understand when we later on we're going to talk about plant selection. And later on, this is what's happening when this late succession species, in this case this is from Chingling Mountain, where the fir trees, they are the late succession species, coming up, taking the space away from the birch trees. This is Betula utilis, the Himalaya birch. It's very dramatic pictures, just taking over, and the birch, they know the end of the story. I'm doomed here. And then after a while, this be a complete fir forest, and then it's the end of the journey, the climax forest. If there is no further disturbance, this is the end of the vegetation on this side. So by understanding the different phases, stages of the succession, and the limitation, but also the opportunity in the different, then makes it possible to understand why some species belong. For example, this is the pictures Andrew from the Chingling Mountains. Some species always grows inside a forest because they want to grow it. High humidity, less weed competition, they want that. They belong there. So by understanding where in the structure, where in the time lag of a vegetation development the plants do their entrance, but also where they exist, gives a very, very good guidance of where and how to use them. We did, for a long time ago, a case study in Appalachian Mountains in eastern US. We did this profile diagram. We actually analyzed the structure of different forests. And you can see the pioneer species, the one up here, this is the tulip trees, Liriodendron tulipifera. And also understand we are the secondary species, or the late succession species, and which species are always going to be in here. And suddenly you understand why some of these species that grows inside a forest stand are difficult to establish in an open ground situation, because they have no idea how to handle it. Because this is Magnolia tripetula, the big leaf magnolia. This is where it grows inside, protected here, this lovely place. And if we plant it outside, there is a completely different game for that plant. And it's a funny story. This is my best friend's neighbor. This is how garden design looks in Sweden for the moment. I don't know what's wrong with them. Anyway, look at the trees here. This is a fir tree. Abies normaniana, what's that in English? Norman fir, yeah, Norman fir. And it's really interesting, when I'm barbecuing with my friend, I can actually hear it screaming in the evening. Please, kill me. Because here, you force these poor plants into a place which represented more or less the day after the forest fire. And if you look at how it grows in the Caucasus, in Georgia, it grows inside, when it's a young tree like this, inside, protected by alders and birch trees. And after maybe 100 years, like, oh, now I'm ready to be exposed. But here, completely wrong. It died 2 years after that, thanks. Because the second year, it was still alive. It was going wrong. But then it died, thankful. Otherwise, I have to do something about it. But all the theory went wrong. But it died, anyway. But this is the problem, that we force plants into a situation or in a phase they don't have any clue how to do it. Another example is this. This is a hornbeam. That's Carpinus betulus. Yeah. It's a hornbeam, yeah. And this is close to the coastal area of Malmö. You can see it. Young plants as a hedge, exposed to a lot of wind. This is, and Carpinus betulus is a late successful species. So they also want to have a protected situation as a young plant. And here, you're planting extremely exposed to the wind. They're dying. It's really fun to look further down here. Behind the buildings, in the shade of the building, they just, fine, love it. What are you talking about? This is great. Because the building acting as a nursery tree for the young plants. It's important to say that it is possible to establish late successional species in an exposed site like this. It is, but you have to be aware that then I have to put in a lot of effort. Because why doesn't this exposed or this late successional species are successful in this early stage? Because weed competition is exposed with wind and sun and everything. Then you have to compensate that. And suddenly, these plants are very expensive to establish there. So it's not impossible, but you have to be aware that you work against the nature a little bit. And that's fine, but you have to know it. But if you work with the nature, yeah, another species, a pioneer species that grows, likes this environment, can take it, no problem whatsoever. Okay? So by including the succession, because when you have a project in front of you, try to identify where in the succession is my project. Is it an old park environment which will pimp up this wooded land? Then you are in a late succession phase. Then you work with late succession species because they're more shade tolerant. They can be established underneath an already existing tree canopy. But is this a new build area? I will be in an early phase of the succession. Then I have to think about it. Should I be easy established trees or should I work against the nature? Fine, but then I have to maybe include like 3, 4, 5 years of establishment maintenance, for example, watering and so on, and weeding and so on. So when you come to this phase, you have to think about it. Where am I in the succession phase? Because it's important in the plant selection. Try to understand where am I through ecological phases there. And this is also funny. This is the place where my kids, I have 2 twin boys, 2 years old. They are in this monkey phase right now, climbing on everything. But this is the place in the summer where I will place them. Play here. This is in the middle of day in July. And here I'm going to sit and look at them fading away because it's going to be 35 degrees warm in there. Because they have planted a tree that one of the most sensitive for weed competition, this is rowan, Sorbus aucuparia, which are very, very sensitive to have a weed competition all the way in to the canopy. So the trees, this is planted in the 80s. So the trees haven't grown much. And you can see where the shade is. It's like here. The shade should be over here. So this is a problem. You take a plant, wrong plants for the situation, or you haven't worked with it. And suddenly the whole ecosystem service the tree should deliver on this site have failed completely. So you see, the plant selection is important. Understanding where am I in the succession are important there. So I thought we're going to go through some of the trees that can be easy established, like this pioneer species that could be planted instead of this rowan there. And just to give you some example, of course, populus. The general populus are more or less just pioneer species in park environment, established really quick because they have this agenda to be quick, fast out with the root system. And we don't have this species in our guide, but I want to show it anyway. If you ask Tony, you have another 10 species of populus that he thinks is beautiful. But this is my favorite, Populus simonii. Do you agree, or? Yeah? This is a beautiful tree, not only in the summer, because in the summer they have these shiny green leaves, autumn colors in yellow, really, really nice. But in the winter, because you can see a little bit here, the branch is hanging. So it's a really nice tree to have in a position where you have also some wind, because then suddenly you have a ghost on a stick here, because moving really, really nice here. But populus, this is simonii, just an example of a tree that can take this early succession phase and can take the weed competition really well, this exposed situation really, really well. Populus simonii is just an example of it. That's a group there. We talk about maples, of course. Red maple. This is Acer rubrum. This is from the New England area with these fantastic autumn colors. It's important when you choose Acer rubrum. If you choose just the species, if you write to Bartram's to say, I want Acer rubrum, it's like to go into a car shop and like, I want a car. That's it. You can end up with a Ferrari, but you also can end up with a Dacia Logan 2.5 liter. Because you have to be more precise when it comes to Acer rubrum. So therefore, in our guide, we stress really much to, if you want to have good autumn colors, a good growth, go for a cultivar instead, because then you know you will have good autumn colors and or good tree crown as well. So that's the thing with Acer rubrum. But Acer rubrum is fast established, grows really quick in this early phase of the succession. So it's really, really useful. And then you have the close related is the silver maple. This is how they grow in the wild. Grows close to the wetlands, close to rivers and so on. And this is how it grows in as a solitary tree. Beautiful trees, grows really, really quick, have the same attitude as poplars. They're established really, really fast and grows really, really quick. But it's important, this pioneer species doesn't become so old, like 60, 70 years, then it's fine, then it's done, then you take it away. But if you have a tree that goes up quick and solve a lot of ecosystem services, you can plant at the same time late successional species that grows in the shadows of these big trees. And after 40, 50 years, you take this way, and then you have the late successor species there. Have become a big tree, more or less anonymous in the shade of this. But there is an interesting crossing between these two, the red maple and silver maple, because they have good and bad sides, both of these two species. But in this crossing, they create this, the Acer freemanii, and it starts to be pretty common here in UK, but it could be tell a little bit, or it could be promote a little bit even further on. And the cultivar which is in cultivation is this Autumn Blaze, which have these fantastic autumn colors. I planted just outside close, like 1 meter from my house. My wife doesn't know how big it is going to be. It's going to be enormous. It's going to eat up all the house, but I don't know. She figure out sooner or later. The thing is, we have our bedroom on the 2nd floor, and the tree crown now is on the 2nd floor now. So we have this white bedroom, everything's white, roof, wall, everything's white, but during 3-4 weeks in autumn, our bedroom is pink. Because all the autumn colors from Autumn Blaze just comes into the bedroom, and we have a pink, very like 1986 type of bedrooms. Really, really cool. So strong is the autumn colors there. And it's really fun, but also Autumn Blaze, they have a long autumn period. It starts with some colors here and then goes further down. And it takes weeks before the whole tree is completely red. So that's another fine quality of this cultivar. Another pioneer species that we grow a lot in Sweden, and I think grows really well here in the UK as well, is Myerscough mixta. Easy to establish, grow really quick, fantastic autumn colors. Do you have any?
We have a lot, and it's changed. There's a lot of different
Yeah.
provinces that have changed the names.
Yeah.
So you need to be really careful.
Yeah, the stuff we do is this Ullungensis. We do a lot in Sweden, grows really, really well. Is that the stuff you? Yeah. Birches, of course. There is more than Betula pendula. This is my favorite, Betula languinensis or Betula lenta. Become a large growing tree, more shade tolerant compared to the Betula pendula. And autumn colors are fantastic. The leaves are bigger. The leaves are very comparable to Prunus avium, cherry. That kind of size of leaves that they have. And also the autumn colors are clear yellows. Beautiful, beautiful tree. Grows really, really quick. Become, as I said, a large tree. Even if it grows close to a building or close to other tree, it still have an even tree canopy because it's more shade tolerant. We call it, sometimes it's marked as a semi-secondary species. This is the trunk. Some of them have this beautiful trunk. So far, there is no cultivation, no selection of these species. So when you buy the species, it's more or less just a true species there. But it's a beautiful one and varies somehow. But a species that varies a lot is this one, Betula albocinensis, or Utilis albocinensis, depending on which book you refer to. Anyway, this is the extreme. This is from China in the mountains. This is the extremes, the variation within the species. You can find the whitest one, and this is the reddish one, same species. So when you have a species with this variation, you have to be careful, because if you're just ordering the true species, you can end up with anything. Normally, this is what you want, And then you have to go for a cultivar that have this dark red color on the trunk there. But the same, belongs to the species that grows really quick in this open ground environment. Tulip tree, of course. This is one of few stands I found when I lived in the US of tulip trees there. It's a fantastic forest, like 65 meters tall trees, trunks enormous. It's a pioneer species, grows really quick in disturbed areas, and have really nice seasonal qualities. And of course, magnolias. This is just an example of Magnolia acuminata. But when it comes to magnolias, it's important to screen what magnolias is in cultivation, but also which size, because there is special nurseries that grows more or less just magnolias there. But then you get a plant like this big. So you have to see which species or which cultivars are available at bigger trees, because bigger trees are more resilient for urban environments, because they can take some more sabotage. Is that the right sabotage? Yeah, all right. So my favorite one is called Magnolia Galaxy, because it's grown in a nursery, and you can find trees like 30, 35 centimeters in trunk, really, really big trees of this cultivars. And it do the job. It's really easy to get on a good local identity of a site by using Magnolia Galaxy. Still, all the magnolia belongs to park or garden environment. That's it, because they have, if you look at the charts Andrew showed earlier on the turgor loss and also the cavitation curve, all magnolias ended up as sensitive for drought. So they all belong to park and garden habitats there. A picture from Kew when it comes to cherry. Why I chosen to just talk a little bit about flowering cherry is that it's a plant group also, simple points, easy points to take, but it's important to understand that the roots of prunus, all prunus except the section of pardus. What's that in English? Pardus, prunus pardus. Bird cherry. They can take more wet sites, but the rest of flowering cherries are extremely sensitive for compact and waterlogged soil. Is that correct? Everybody should look down and note. Okay, I take it again. Everybody. Flowering cherry is very, very sensitive to compact and poorly drained soil, okay? Because they die or get all this bad stuff, diseases and stuff. So that's really important to bear in mind, but still, it's one of the most beautiful, together with magnolias, that do the job in a park environment. And there is some species I would like to talk a little bit more with. Prunus yeduensis is a species that in Sweden anyway was very common in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and then it just disappeared. And now it started to come back again because it is one of the most remarkable flowering cherries. That's the Tokyo cherry, the one that the Japanese just closed the whole country for a couple of days just to worship the cherry trees there. That's the one species there. And it's a fantastic tree in public areas. Season qualities like, yeah, you see the spring flowers, but also autumn colors there. Another cultivar we use a lot in Sweden, and I saw in the US works a lot, is this accolade, Prunus accolade, which is a hybrid. Beautiful, it grows really quick, flowering like a dream, pink dream. And also the season quality is also very, very nice. This is the autumn colors in southern Sweden of the same species there. All right? It's okay? Yeah, all right. Let's talk about street environments then. Street environments it's hard to find this is what street environment represent, because this picture from Stockholm, this is Stockholm. This is where the king lives. If you know, we also have a royal family. Not as fun as your royal family. You can see here on the north side of a street, you can see the trees are much bigger, because on that side you have less aggressive evapotranspiration. So the trees are doing really well there, still street environment. But if you go 20 meters over the road to the south side of the road, where they're exposed to a much higher temperature, you have a much more aggressive evapotranspiration. You can also see how trees have died here, and they are smaller compared to that side. So street environments or paid environments varies a lot due to the microclimate and the site situation. And also the pits, the planting pits, are really important. So when it comes to paid environment, street environment, the design of planting pits should always go hand in hand together with the tree selection. I know that the TDAG did a really good job with a tree solution, that they evaluate this, the structure, soil, and so on. In Stockholm, I would like to say that Stockholm has a world-leading position when it comes to testing different kind of structural soil solutions there. They even work with stormwater management. They take the water from the sidewalks, even from the roof, into the planting pits. And suddenly they create planting environment in street environment that when it comes to soil moisture in a way is comparable to park environment. So they actually succeed with magnolias in paid environment, and they grow really, really well, because in Sweden we don't have the microclimate, the temperatures, but in the city center we have a higher temperatures because of the urban heat island effect. And if we can add soil moisture to that, magnolia grows really, really well in Stockholm for this moment. So when it comes to street environment, it can vary a lot. So bear that in mind. But in this selection guide we have worked with, we have said that street environments represent situation which could be very extreme when it comes to droughts, especially when you have this runoff, water runoff, and also the microclimate with pretty aggressive evapotranspiration. But I have a question. Do we have time? What's my time?
15.
All right, cool. I have a question for you guys. Think about this scenario. We have a field, agriculture field, when we plant a pine tree, Pinus sylvestris. We do everything to make it establish really well. We're watering, we take away all the weeds, and they're standing there alone. So I have unlimited resources below ground and above ground. We're watering, so it's established really well. Okay, you with me? We do the same with Populus tremula, the aspen, 232 meters beside to the left on the pine tree. Same condition, we work really hard to establish really well. And well, when these two are really established on site, we leave them for 10 years. And then all of us come back to these two trees in 10 years. Which of these three have grown tallest? There will be a prize in this. Because I watch football every Saturday, the Premier Leagues. I know you like beers in this country. All right? Okay. Who's going to be the tallest? Populus. Yeah? That's not enough for a beer. Of course, if you come back 10 years, the poplar is probably 2 or 3 times larger or bigger, taller than the pine tree. The question for the beer is, why is the poplar 2 or 3 times taller than the pine? All right? Let's hear it. They're both pioneer species. So they both belong to this early succession phase. So no, not beer there. Sorry? No. They both have root system that goes deep enough, and they don't have to go deep. They can be all over the place. No. No, we take away all the weeds. Sorry? Yeah, they grow side by side in Sweden, the pine and the poplars, yeah.
One of them is evergreen and the other one is...
Yeah, that's close to a beer there, but not enough.
I don't like it.
No, all right.
Is it light conditions? They exploit the light conditions?
No, they're really good to have. They need full sun, both of them, full sunlight. So they don't have like, I'm better than you in the photosynthesis. No, it's not there.
The aspens taken up by the amount of water.
Yeah, not that. Oh, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, they have a consumption is higher, but no, that's not the reason completely.
The poplar sucker indicates its own microclimate for growth.
Yeah, a little bit, but not that. Okay, last one.
Poplar's a rock star when the other one's a classical musician. He lives fast, dies young, and the pinus hangs on a bit longer.
There you go.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. The thing is, the investment. Think about private economy. The poplars invest in cheap stuff, really cheap stuff, plastic stuff, made in Taiwan or whatever you can produce really cheap stuff. Look at the leaves, it's like silk. Then also, if you look at the wood density is really bad, or it's weak. But the thing is, the resources our poplars collected last year, 2017, they're going to invest this year, 2018. So if the poplars invest in cheap stuff, leaves and wood structure, they have plenty of resources left, so they can invest in aggressive growth below and above ground. So by investing this aggressive growth below ground, they can occupy larger soil volume, so they can take more resources. Above ground, this aggressive growth above ground makes the tree canopy bigger, so they can take even more sunlight to be a successful photosynthesis. All right? Pine tree invest in really, really expensive quality, like made in Sweden, really, really good stuff. Because the leaves, the needles, have to be there for several years. There are some foxtail pines that have needles like 25, 30 years. So the investment have to be for several years. So they cost a lot of money. A lot of resources collected last year have to go on this stuff. Also, the wood structure are expensive. It's quality, made in Sweden, even here. That means that there's less resources for the pine species, or the pine, to grow really aggressive below and above ground. So that's why it's slower, okay? So it's all about private economy. So this is also interesting to understand the investment, the agenda of investment different species and cultivars have. By understanding this investment, it also gives you an idea how good they are for different kind of site situation. Because if we push these two species into a street environment, who have the best investment? Sorry? Pine, of course. Because the investment pine have done make it more tolerant for tougher conditions like street environment. But these cheap investment makes the species very successful in places where there are more or less unlimited resources like a parkland. But when it comes, if you push it into a street environment, they don't have the defense or the traits that can take this stressful, all right? Another thing is also, when we talk about street tree, I'm going to give you some example of good street trees. They all belong to this group of trees that invest in expensive but quality stuff. That makes these trees slower to establish them. So when you do these planting plans and selection plans, you have to design special management plans for the species you have chosen. For street environment, they are slow in their establishment due to their investment. So they might need 3, 4, 5 years of watering, mulching, before they are established well, before the roots is out there and can support itself. But if you plant a popular species in park environment, 2 years, done, it can support itself. So it's important to bear in mind, the more stress-tolerant trees you choose for the stressful environment, good, but then you have to also invest some of them. So these trees sometimes are more expensive, both to buy in because they grow slower on the nursery, but also more expensive to invest in the beginning. But when these trees establish well, they have the equipment to fix the site, all right? So this is very important to bear in mind when we talk about stress-tolerant trees. They have a special personality that needs to be taken care of, all right? Andrew wants me to talk about the research I'm doing, because what I'm doing research now for the moment is that I travel around the world. It's pretty stupid work I have. They pay me to traveling around the world to try to find central London, central Copenhagen, central Berlin, to try to find where does the trees grow in natural habitats which are comparable to inner-city environments in different parts of the world. So what we do is this. We start to do different kind of calculation where we try to calculate the evapotranspiration, the water net differences in different parts of the world. This is from a case study we did last year in Georgia and Caucasus, southern Caucasus and Azerbaijan, where we try to find central London today, but also central London in 100 years from now in the climate change scenario. And I think London is here somewhere. Yeah, London, future climate, low residential, future climate, high residential area, and so on. So by doing this, it's possible to find areas in the world where trees grows under similar conditions in urban environment. Because Andrew showed earlier that it's not about the species tolerance, sometimes even for the ecotype, because he showed that the red maple, same species, different kind of genotype, have different kind of drought tolerance. So as a botanic garden, or a botanist, or a fake botanist as I am, the new generation of plant hunting will be this, I believe so, when you try to pinpoint different kind of ecotypes of species in order to really design the one for urban environments. Because when it comes to our collection, like Kew, Ness, Gothenburg Botanical Garden, I'm not sure that the best genetic materials is in cultivation. Some of them is still out there to be collected. So that's why the urban forestry industry need to collaborate with botanic gardens to be part of this selection process that botanic garden have the history to do. But now the urban forestry people, like you guys, need to be part of this selection process in order to find the right genetic materials and so on. So this is the work we did in Georgia last year. We did it in China and Romania. And this is the places where we worked. This is London, guys. This is the forest in central Georgia there, with Selkova, Selkova carpinifolia. We have Carpinus orientalis, a forest of them. This is close on the border to Chechnya. This is Selkova carpinifolia again, as a solitary tree. This is trunk. This is a traditional dendrological picture. It's like, take a picture of me standing with a tree. That's me there. Celtis caucasica, northeast Georgia, for example. So this is the stuff we do. This is from China, where we try to find street environments, but in natural habitats. We work with the ecological matching to try to find ecological vegetation systems that have more or less the same kind of site conditions, urban areas. So that's the work I do. This is the steppe forest of northeast Romania there, where we find Acer tataricum as one of the most drought-tolerant maple we have in Europe. And this is from a courtyard in Lund, north of Malmö in southern Sweden. This is a courtyard on concrete because it's a planting or parking deck below. So it's a very thin soil layer, but still the tree like, bring it on, fix it, because it originated from a really, really stressful habitat. So more trees that originate from this stressful environment, that do the job, have this investment, like the pine tree I talked earlier about. They invest in stuff, like made in Sweden stuff, that can make them tolerable for urban environment. For example, Syringa reticulata is, I'm so bad in English names of plants. Lilac. Yeah, it's a lilac. Tree lilac. Syringa reticulata. This is a cultivar called ivory silk, which is a more upright type. It's extremely slow to establish, but well established, it can tolerate really, really tough conditions. And it grows. And also bear in mind, when it comes both to Acer tataricum and tree lilac, buy big trees. Because there are few things that are so sad to look at as a teenage tree of tree lilac and Acer tataricum. Everybody haven't had this successful teenage phase like me and Andrew, because we were very popular in school during a teenage area. Not at all. So if you buy a bigger tree, the size of the tree, suddenly you get actually a tree. Otherwise you have one branch there, one branch there, and that's pretty much it. And you can't be angry to Bartram, like, what the hell have you given me? This is what the species look like in this teenage phase. So bear in mind that. So ask people at Bartram, run out, take a picture, text you to see how a tree looks like. And then you can see, like, oh, we have to go up a couple of sizes in order to get a tree that we want. It's a really, really good looking tree, tolerant, nice colors. When you call it ecosystem services for high biodiversity, this is an important species for that. It flowers in July, August. In July, August. And how many trees that produce a rich source of nectar do we have in July, August? Not many at all. When we come to native species, none. So this is just bollocks when it comes to, no, we just have to have native species in order to secure high biodiversity. It's just rubbish. This is an important tree in order to secure a long season of nectar for insects there. Pine tree, of course, 2 and 3 needle pines. This is Pinus nigra. Grows really well. This is from Stockholm. It's an impaled environment, really, really tough trees, especially when you look when it grows. This is from Crimea, which is Ukraine or Russia. You can choose. This is where we did a lot of work before the Russian come, anyway. So this is the pine tree grows on the slopes down to the Black Sea. And it's amazing to see how trees actually can grow there at all, because it's just gravel, stone and gravel. And then you can see the late successful species like, I like it here, underneath the canopy of the pine trees here. This is the Black Sea Pinus nigra there, growing in almost nothing. And this is a plantation in Gothenburg. This is 5 years ago. The trees are like 3 times larger than it is, but it grows really well. The planting piece is not only this, half of this sidewalk is also structured soil, so the trees can have actually a pretty good space for the roots anyway. But it's a good tree. And when it comes to ecosystem service, especially regulating ecosystem services, a lot of research shows that pine or conifer trees, evergreen trees, have capacity that wins over broadleaf trees. So I believe we're going to see more and more conifers in public plantation, and pines, especially the 2 or 3 needle pines, are really, really tough because the iridium from really tough growing condition there. The last one is from the steppe forest of northeast Romania. This is one of my favorite trees. This is silver lime, Tilia tomentosa. And it's really cool to go to Kew and look at the silver lime on a rainy day. The silver lime is green. But if you go back there, a sunny, warm day, the silver lime is silver. Because what's happening in a day, this is a day, a sunny day or a hot day, like 40 degrees Celsius a day. It's an ordinary day in the steppe here. They twist the leaves. The silver backside of the leaf, they twist it to the sky, and by doing that, it reflects away sunlight, so the leaf canopy doesn't get overheated. Because if the canopy get overheated, the tree have to use a lot of water in order to cool down the leaves. So that's an avoiding strategy that Andrew talked about, really, really successful. But when it comes, I'll come back to that later. But that's really good, you can see it there. A day as a warm day, the silver maple or the silver lime is a really tough tree. Another oak tree that I really like from this forest is the Hungarian oak. I think that's Hungarian oak, Quercus frainetto. It's fantastic. There is a cultivar called Trump. Sadly, it's a really good looking tree. It's an upright type of Quercus frainetto. I don't know. I think there's a Trump tower they thought about because it grows really up there. I think they have to change the name to be successful to commercialize. But this is a tough tree that grows really good in this some of the extreme sites, and also have a nice light through the tree canopy due to this cut leaves. It lets a lot of sunlight go through the tree canopy. It's a beautiful tree. And the last slide there before I quit there because I see the lunches. This is a silver lime. This is a cultivar called Brabant. But if you're out driving your car, you have to know the difference between a common lime and a silver lime. Do you know why? Yeah, honeydew. Because due to the hair on the back side of the leaf of silver lime, they don't have any problem with, what you call this, leech or aphids. And then you don't have any honeydew from the leaves coming down. So this is a really good tree for a parking lot or places where you actually have some kind of activity below in a pay. Because when common lime, both Tilia cordata, europea, platyphylla, when they get stressed, heat and drought stressed, they get very suitable or susceptible to aphids. And then you have the honeydew. Welcome to Gothenburg. We have a street through the Gothenburg which is like in the summer. Everything's black. All the cars is black beneath there. But if you plant silver lime, it's fine. So silver lime is a tree that we should use much, much more. And Corylus columna, this is from Stockholm, a new built area in Stockholm. It grows really, really well, have the same shape there, and also belong to this slow established tree. But as you know, it's all about the investment. All right, thank you very much.